Good afternoon once again. 2 o'clock, I guess it is time for us to begin. And before we get into pragmatism, just to remind you guys that we have exactly 2 weeks now until the final exam. And I want to talk a little bit about the final exam now, since it is approaching and there will be some good news, I guess. So first of all, remember that the final exam is on May 10th, right? That is a Monday, 2 weeks from today, exactly 2 weeks from today. Just like usual, it will start at midnight. Once Monday begins, you have 24 hours to complete it without any penalty. Again, just as usual, it will be 45 minutes. Just as usual, it will be 30 questions. And just as usual, in case if you miss it, you will have another 24 hours after that, Tuesday, May 11th, to do it with the 10% penalty. Now, what is different about it now? First of all, it covers the entire course, right? So roughly half of the questions will come from the first 2 exams. Therefore, all 3 reviews are in play now. If you prepared for the first 2 exams, you really don't have to do anything there except just pull up your notes from the first 2 exams. You have already attempted all these questions, and so you should know if some of them you got wrong. At least maybe you get the feeling that you got it wrong, even if you don't remember it exactly. But if you did get it wrong, you may want to double check that and figure out what was wrong. And of course, you know there is a review. I actually messaged you this review for the this part of the course after the second exam. These questions will also be there. Will be about half of the overall questions, so not as many of them will be there as usual, but they will be there, and you do need to prepare all of them. If you do not have the review, all 3 reviews are available on Canvas and the files. See the tab called Files, you go there, there's all 3 reviews there, and syllabus. Okay, now one thing I'm doing different for this exam, and I actually has debated with myself about that, whether I should do it or not, but given that we are in a pandemic, a lot of people may have been thrown off by personal events or whatever. I decided to do it, even though usually I don't do it for 101. So this is what I'm going to do. The grade on the final will override your grade for the course. Meaning, if you get, say, 75% on the final, this is a C. Suppose you are actually doing worse than that in the course. Suppose you only have 60% in the course after the final is factored in. Your total is 60%. You will still get a C then, because 75%. What happens if you got 100% or 99% or 98% on the final? You will get an A in course, even if you don't have enough points otherwise. So whichever one the highest, if the course is highest, then I'll still give you that grade even if you do worse on the final. But if the final is higher than your total, I will give you a better grade which you got on the final, right? So it's not going to be any less than what you get on the final. That, of course, gives you an extra chance to recover if right now maybe you have a very low grade. How is extra credit going to factor in with all of that? Well, extra credit, like I said, will only be added to your total before the final, assuming you have extra credit. It will add up to 10%. So suppose you have 60 total and you have maximum 10% extra credit, that'll be 70%. And note that I actually do not add it on Canvas. I add it for myself. Nonetheless, if you want to know how many points of extra credit you have, you can ask me. In the end, I will decide what percentage of the total it is based on how everybody did, and that will just improve your grade. Note that in that case, if you got 75% on the final, it is still higher, so you're still getting a C rather than C minus, which is 70%. But that will only apply to the total, not to the final. So if your final is lower than that, then none of it even matters to you. But if your final is higher than that, then of course that matters. Suppose you have already 70%, right? And maximum amount of extra credit, so that brings you up to 80%. And you got 75% on the final. Well, then it doesn't matter what you got on the final. Your final grade will be based on this 80%. Okay, so extra credit still will matter. Your total grade will still matter. It's just an extra chance for you to improve your grade, especially for those of you who are doing very badly. And there are, of course, students who have like, I don't know, 20, 30%, and hopefully they can pull themselves up by the bootstraps and, you know, prepare very well and get at least a C in class. And again, I want to remind you that if you want to apply for pass-fail grade, do not send me any messages. I do not deal with pass-fail grade. That is between you and the department. Second thing is you can only do that after all the grades have been assigned. I think it says on Canvas that you can only do it after the May 16th. So if you don't like your grade after it's been assigned and you want to do pass or fail instead of the actual grade, you can petition to the department after May 16th. But I would strongly advise you to talk to your college advisor before you do that. And again, not to me, because I'm not qualified to give you advice about that. But your college advisor should be able to. If you don't have one, just contact college advising team. They will give you one. Why it's important? Because if you do that, if you switch from letter grade to pass-fail, that can affect your financial aid. In some cases, you may lose money. In some cases, you may lose financial aid. So be very careful about that. College advisors have ways to assess all that. They know all the rules, so they can give you advice. So before you do anything like that, definitely talk to them, and they will tell you whether it makes any sense for you or not. Okay, any questions? No questions? All clear? Note, for those of you guys who are doing well in class, that's obviously not going to take anything away from you, right? You still can get good grade. It's just a way to help those who are not doing that great. Unfortunately, especially after the second exam, lots of people have dropped quite a bit because some people didn't take it seriously now. So definitely take the final seriously. Okay, and remember, again, all these questions, you need to watch the videos. You need to prepare. And, well, we have 16 people in class right now. I hope the rest, the other 14 or whatever people, will watch the video after at some point. And I hope they will watch other videos, because otherwise I don't think you will be able to take the final successfully or pass this class for that matter. Because if you fail again on the final, that's going to be pretty bad. Okay, now let's look back at Kierkegaard and see how well you guys understood what was going on. So what are, according to Kierkegaard, the three stages or modes of existence? And again, will be an extra credit question. What do you guys remember there? Aesthetic, ethical, and religious. okay, but not so much naming them, but what are they? What does that mean? Aesthetic, ethical, and religious. Why do we go through them? What's the goal there? Let's put it this way. Right, that seems to be a harder question, right? Because just to remember what they are called is much easier than to figure out why is he bothering? What's with the stages? What does that all mean? Remember, he is saying that we actually should go through them. That's important. Yeah, it refers to our views of life, but again, what's the goal there? What's the purpose? What do we want to achieve? Well, that is the final stage, but why? Again, why religion? Why not something else? Why not stay in the ethical, for example? Well, again, the question is why, because this is kind of goes around the answer. So, to become authentic, to become your true self, that is why. We need to become authentic and our true selves. And again, if you further ask, why do we need that? To be at peace with ourselves, to be happy. That is essentially the goal. And remember, that is more or less what Hegel was talking about too, and Marx. And that's, in the end of the day, what philosophy is about. We're here, we're living this life, but we want to be happy. How are we becoming happy? Note, this is the question we kept on asking from the very, very beginning. And this is the most fundamental question. So now what we're getting towards the end, we starting to narrow down on it, so to say. So that's the point. Kierkegaard is saying we go through these stages not automatically, but how? Well, that is the second one here. How does one move from one stage to the other? How and why, I would say. So you're in a static stage. You experience despair. Note that you can experience that despair forever. You can be stuck there with despair and just be a miserable person. But why would you move on? A productive member of society, that's a bit more of Hegel, Marx. Note that Kierkegaard is not talking about you being a member of society. He is not even talking about society. That is for him completely inessential. Remember, if you go back to this idea, the way we talked about it last time, once again, for Hegel, our relations with others are the most important thing. For Kierkegaard, our relations with ourselves is the most important thing. Whether or not there are others, to Kierkegaard doesn't even matter, because you are this essential individual who exists. And so you have to take care of your own life. And that to him can only be done, again, if you achieve this final stage. The stage can be achieved how? Only through your passionate choice. Free, passionate choice. Remember again the three doors. How do you choose between these three doors? Passionate choice. There's no logical necessity for you to go and become a musician. There's no logical necessity for you to become a lawyer. That is your choice. You have to make it. What would be an attempt to avoid it? That would be to let somebody else or something else decide for you. For example, flip a coin. That's one way to avoid choices. Another way, let your parents decide. Your parents know better. They think you should be a lawyer, great. You'll be a lawyer. Now, maybe several years down the road, you'll discover they were right. Then you'll say, well, my parents were right. But what happens if you discover they were not right? Then what happens? That's a situation you can easily imagine, right? Suppose your parents told you to become a lawyer, you study for many years, you pass the goddamn LSAT and then the bar exam, and you become a lawyer. And then you're miserable. So what do you say? Yeah, they were wrong. Note that you're shifting the blame now to them. I didn't make any choices. Why am I to blame? It's my parents, my damn parents. They made the choice for me. I'm blaming them. So, isn't it convenient? It's very convenient. But guess what? It's your life. It's not their life. So if your life is ruined, you're at the receiving end of it, not your parents. So that's what Kierkegaard is saying. You should take that responsibility upon you. You may fail. It's quite possible. You will become a musician, will never make a penny. But then at least you will have only yourself to blame. So the movement from stage to stage can only be made through this free passionate choice, which you have to do. Remember the comparison with the peasant who's asleep at the wheel. Don't be that peasant. Grab that goddamn wheel. This is what living is. Difficult choices. Some of them are right, some of them are wrong. Okay, so we do indeed get desperate, but we can stay in desperation unless we make this passionate choice and force ourselves to move to the next stage. Now, obviously, we already kind of answered that, but at what stage does one truly become a self, and why? So the first part we kind of answer, right? And it's easy to remember again. Yeah, sure, religious stage. Easy. But why? Why is that the only stage you truly become self? Well, stopping doubting ourselves obviously is part of it. So the way Kierkegaard himself answers it is, you may not remember from the last lecture, because we are standing naked in front of God. It's just us and God. There's nobody else. There's nobody to blame. There's nobody to shift blame on. It's just you and God. And that's it. And you essentially are responsible there for your actions, because you are making all these choices. And so that truly is you. You can't hide from that. You cannot any longer blame the parents or the society or anybody else. It's full responsibility which is on your shoulders. You are standing there naked in front of God. Okay, now one question there we may wonder about: do you think that is practical approach? Like, remember he was saying that Hegel's philosophy is not very helpful because you need to know how to live your life. Now, if you look at the Kierkegaard himself in his philosophy, is that something you can like really take as a guidance for your life? What could be a problem there? Yeah, like it on one hand it obviously rings true that we should not take this laid back attitude. We should grab the reins of life. And one way I can answer it, let's say, again, if this stuff is what, let's say, Kierkegaard talks to Hegel, and he tells him all that, and he says, yeah, this is, you have to make this passionate choice, all that stuff. What would Hegel answer here? With the three doors, right? Philosopher, musician, doctor, medical doctor. The Hegel would say, yes, you have to make this choice. But guess what? There's still right choice and there's still wrong choice. You may not know it, but there is one. It's not relative. If you become a musician and then that's a failure, how is it a good thing? It's not a good thing. So, in other words, Hegel would turn it back on you and say, hey, you think that there is no right choice. You think that all the choices are equal or something. Well, they are not. Of course they are not. Yes, you do have to make these choices yourself, but nonetheless the right choice is there. And you could make a mistake. And you could make a right choice. And that's why, in the end of the day, Hegel would say, that does not change anything. It just makes my example a little more complicated compared to simplicity of you'll be happy here, you'll be robbed here. But the essence of it stays the same. How do you make these choices? What is leading you towards one choice rather than the other? Right? Why would you become a musician rather than a lawyer? And that is not something you can just make up, because you are an existing individual. You have existing interests. You have existing abilities. They are there, and you cannot just fake them up. You cannot will yourself to become a successful musician if you really are not good at either music or vocals or anything like that. Well, maybe in current society you could kind of try, I don't know, some sort of a punk band. But nonetheless, it's not that easy. Then it will just prove that you actually have some abilities necessary for that. And this is where we kind of can enter into pragmatism. Pragmatism, like I said, is very American in many ways. American input into the philosophy, most distinctive American contribution, reflects American culture in some way, as many people say, down-to-earth, practical approach. Pragmatism, pragma in ancient Greek just means an act or a deed. So it kind of turns it all back towards action, towards practical application. It was born in the 19th century, considerably later than when Kierkegaard was writing. He was already dead by this time, 1870s, roughly, when Peirce was writing his work, although it really, you can say, really didn't pick up until more of a 20th century. Nonetheless, it goes back towards 1870s. It goes back to actually Hegelian philosophy, which was also widely popular in the United States at the time, and it was kind of a reaction to that, closely connected. And we can talk about many representatives, but two of the most important ones perhaps is Charles Sanders Peirce and William James. Okay, first C.S.Peirce. One of the most fundamental works which started pragmatism is his The Fixation of Belief. It's not a very long work, and this is where he kind of describes his attitude. Peirce by himself actually never became famous or anything like that. He is an interesting figure because he wrote a lot, and today it's considered very influential, and there's a lot of work being done on his legacy. Nonetheless, while he was still alive, he didn't even have an academic position. He was working in Geological Society or something, and occasionally giving lectures, which were not very well received during his life, and he died in complete poverty. Nonetheless, today that is considered a very influential work, The Fixation of Belief. So what is he talking about in that work? First of all, he wants us to look at how do we produce our beliefs. Figure it out. What is a belief, and how do we produce that? Now, beliefs to Peirce is not just pieces of mental furniture that reside in the mind and not momentary psychological states. What are the beliefs? They're guide which we use for our desires to shape our actions, right? That kind of makes sense. So from the practical point of view, the belief you have is important because it changes the way you act. And this is how Peirce is approaching that. How is this happening? How do our beliefs affect our actions? Well, they are kind of these habits or dispositions we have to act in certain ways. every action at its core has these fundamental beliefs behind it. And if that is not the case, if you have a belief but it doesn't affect your actions in any ways, then Peirce would say it's completely dead. It's non-essential. It doesn't even matter whether you have it or not. Now, note that, of course, when you have a belief and when you act on that belief, the results can be good and bad, right? So that is what essentially determines how useful your beliefs are. Because if you have a set of beliefs and you act on those beliefs, but you are absolutely miserable, then there's something wrong with that. So if, again, how does it relate to Kierkegaard in particular? And note that I don't think they ever read Kierkegaard, neither James nor Peirce. I'm not sure, I'm not 100% sure, but they died in the early 20th century as Kierkegaard's work were just becoming popular. They read Hegel, but probably not Kierkegaard. So anyway, but if they wanted to answer that, they would ask something like this. Well, how did it work for Kierkegaard himself? Did it make him happy? And I guess if you remember anything from the previous two lectures, what would be your answer? What do you guys think? Did he strike you as a happy person? What did we talk about at the very beginning when we talked about Kierkegaard's life? 3 things, right? What are the 3 things? Relationship with his female lover, with his father, but there's a couple of other things. There are a couple of other scandals in particular. So one of them is with this newspaper, magazine, and the other one is with Danish church, the Church of Denmark. So summing it all up, does he strike you as a happy individual? So let's just look at it again. His relation with his female lover. Very painful breakup. Painful for her, painful for him. How about his relation with this magazine, the Corsair? Was it a happy affair? No. He was in total misery, and it made him notorious all over Copenhagen. As a result, he lost his peace of mind. Now, how about Danish church? Did that work very well? No. Again, even though it happened towards the end of his life, again, total misery. So, does it seem to you like he led a happy life? And he, by the way, died very young too, so I don't know if that can be connected to his beliefs, but I certainly don't think that contributed to his happiness either. Happy person? Clearly not. So, from that practical point of view, what Peirce and James would say, there's something wrong here, because this may be an interesting theory, but it doesn't seem to work very well for him. And how would it work for somebody else? Well, we don't really know, but chances are probably not great either. So that is how they suggest we evaluate our beliefs. Note that why do we even have those beliefs? And what happens with our beliefs when they are, let's say, problematic? We enter the state of doubt, right? You have a belief. Let's say you believe that there are no bears in the forest. Then you go to the forest, I don't know, to gather mushrooms or something, and then the bear comes out of the bushes and you run away, hopefully. So clearly there's a problem, right? So you then have this state of a doubt. You're doubting whether your belief was a successful one. Well, in case of a bear, you'd probably know pretty well that it wasn't. But in many other cases, it may not be as obvious. However, if there is a problem with your belief, if systematically the result is not very good, then you will enter the state of doubt. even if you don't have a clear way to figure out what's wrong. But that will create some sort of unhappiness. So the doubt, according to Peirce, is an uneasy and dissatisfied state from which we struggle to free ourselves. I think I'm getting some deliveries there. Never mind that ringing of the bell. Okay, so this is what happens when beliefs do not work. But how can we actually distinguish between any doubt and the useful doubt? He actually talks about Descartes in particular. He's saying just as there can be empty beliefs, the ones which are not important because they don't lead to any consequences whatsoever, you can equally have empty doubts. And he brings Descartes here in his Meditations. Now, do you guys remember what were the doubts Descartes had? Going back to Descartes, what were his doubts? What did he doubt? Yeah, the existence of the world, the existence of everything. Remember, he did eventually figure out that at least he must exist because he is a thinking thing. But everything else, he thought, is questionable. Is there really a chair? Is there really a fireplace? Now, why would Peirce say it's an empty doubt? Because he would say, why would you doubt that? Does it even matter to you in practical terms? Wouldn't you still want to have a chair and a fireplace, whether they are real or not? He'd say that doesn't even matter. So he actually talks about comparing some other philosophers like Berkeley and Hobbes, and saying, well, from practical point of view, is there even any difference between them? So let's take another poll here. Let's get you a little bit engaged. Do you agree that these kind of doubts are empty or not? Yes or no? That's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, it does seem like in philosophy we are asking questions like that, but whether things are real and so on. But from, again, practical point of view, many people would say that's why philosophy is a bunch of nonsense. Because you're asking these kind of questions which really don't make any difference. So anyway, anybody else want to participate? 3 more seconds. I'm publishing it, and it actually is evenly split 5-5. Okay, so there's plenty of philosophers here, I guess. Yeah, so in philosophy we do ask these questions, but naturally, again, if you take this kind of practical American approach, you would wonder, why do we even care? Okay, so we will get to it a little bit later, but the way Peirce approaches it, and he takes the very scientific approach, he's saying there are only meaningful doubts which are important to us. And those are only the kind of doubts which affect how do we act. If that really is something you need to know for the practical purposes, then of course that's meaningful. But whether or not there really is a fireplace in front of you, is that in any way will affect the way you act when you say you are cold? Would you ever stop and not have any fire and instead be cold and miserable there, wondering, is there really a fireplace? No, you would probably assume there is a fireplace, get it burning, and then maybe when you already are warm and relaxed, you will start wondering about whether it's real or not. But at that point, no, that wouldn't even matter very much, right? Because for practical purposes, you already assumed it was there. So Peirce is saying, let us not pretend to doubt in philosophy what we do not doubt in our hearts. And he considers these kind of doubts useless. So how do you eliminate the doubt? He says that there's actually several ways we can do it. Number one, the way to eliminate doubt is what he calls a method of tenacity. What is a method of tenacity? Well, you basically are just sticking to your belief, no matter what. You take any answer you fancy, and you constantly reiterate it to yourself. You know, as they say, I know what I believe and don't confuse me with facts. Okay, now what could be problematic here? You probably can imagine, right? That will meet certain resistance, first of all, from other people. If you have a belief, naturally, at some point, you would need to either share it with other people or at least act on it. And if that belief does not reflect reality, then of course there'll be a problem. Problem with other people, problem with you. That actually is kind of reminding of one of the philosophers we talked about. So who does that remind you of? Does it remind you of anybody? No, Socrates? Well, Socrates seemed like a person who had no beliefs. Because remember, he was also always saying, I don't even know anything. So, how did he have beliefs? He never tried to argue anything. He was asking other people questions. And that's it. No, essentially, you may say, although obviously some people may disagree, you may say this is the approach Kierkegaard is actually advocating. You just believe what you believe. And that's it, end of story. Don't let other people to confuse you. That seems to be the example. Anyway, so this is again why you would have problems, because if that's what you believe, but that's not what, for example, other people believe, then you will run into a problem such as with the Church of Denmark, right? People go to church, they have some nice experience there with other people, praying to God, having good time. And then there's this one individual who tells them, oh, you all been fake. That's not how true Christians believe. Now what will happen? People not going to like it, are they? They are not going to tolerate that. And that's exactly what did happen with Kierkegaard. And then what? Are you going to be happy after that? Probably not. So if you keep it to yourself and you don't tell anybody about it, that makes it a little bit easier for you to get away with it. But as soon as you start sharing it with other people, that definitely is going to be problematic. But even if you keep it to yourself, say you just never go to church because you think it's all fake, again, you may run into problems just based on your behavior, because other people may ask you, why do you never go to church? Do you not believe in God or something? So even if you don't answer these questions, they may still have a problem with you. And note that in that case, you really can only avoid it if you move alone on an uninhabited island. Otherwise, other people will keep on pressuring you, and that will create some sort of a discomfort. So that leads us to the second method of eliminating doubt, method of authority. Now that works for the community as a whole. Employed by the community of believers who allow their beliefs to be dictated by an authority or by an institution. That could equally well apply to ideas such as communism, Marxism. It can apply to ideas, to religious beliefs. Note that that makes things much easier. If you are not alone, if there's many people who believe the exact same thing, you no longer have this kind of a problem, at least as long as you are within this group. If everybody believes in communism and people live in the same country, all kind of build in this communism, then of course you would not have any tension with these other people. Now, is that a good way to go? Well, again, Peirce would say that is not a very good way to go either, because there can still be a problem. Naturally, it would reduce your tension with other people within your group. But as long as you want to be an individual in this case and question that, you will have problem. And that is why, again, countries which have this kind of uniform ideology, such as communist countries, had this very problem, the dissidents, the people who did not believe what everybody else believed. And so that obviously creates problem for them and for the others there. Why would they emerge? Well, because they just honestly don't think that this particular belief is the correct one. It may work for other people, but it doesn't work for them. So again, that would create problems. Now, there's a third way to eliminate doubt, which is a priori method. A priori method actually is kind of the type of rationalists employed. The person arrives at beliefs after a process of reflection. So he actually is not just sticking to them. He is not just believing what other people believe. He questions them. He does actually a reasonable job to question them. And then he says, my reason actually leads me to this particular conclusion. However, note that agreeable to reason is rather subjective. It's based on your personal inclinations, your personal sentiments. Again, it's a little bit of a Kierkegaardian way of coming to these conclusions. It's more sophisticated than just sticking to whatever, but nonetheless, it missing something else there. It can only lead to some well-entrenched intellectual prejudices. So one example you can name here is Plato, right? Plato, the philosophy of Plato, well worked through by this a priori method. Everything has an explanation. It works well for reason, but there's still something wrong with it, which we already kind of addressed when we talked about the Kant's criticism and so on. So he says what we need is a method of fixing belief that does not depend on our human idiosyncrasies, but on some external permanency. The method must be such that the ultimate conclusion of every man shall be the same, or would be the same if inquiry were sufficiently persistent in. Note that this is an important qualification because if you look at Hegel, and that actually is kind of connects him to Hegel here, even though he disagrees with Hegel in many ways, but there is some similarity here. Remember, in Hegel, this ultimate truth which is out there also can only be reached at some point in time, or maybe it will not even be reached in some point in time, but as a result of an effort of the spirit, as a result of an effort of all of us. You can't find your individual truth. So, what do you think this method is, this last force method? Or maybe you know, I don't know. And that, of course, is the best method according to Peirce. The humanity has been struggling for centuries to get there. Made many mistakes. Many difficulties were encountered. But it seems like we're getting there, perhaps. So what is this method? Okay, this is a simple answer, really. Method of science. Science, scientific method. That's what actually provides this kind of a check. It's not just you rationing your way to it. No, you have to have experiments. You have to actually look how does reality respond to your beautiful system. You can create this beautiful system in your head, but once you start employing it to concrete actions, you may meet the resistance. And you cannot override it by just saying, oh, I believe what I believe and I don't care. I don't care if I cannot fly, I'll be jumping off these buildings anyway. Well, good luck with that. You'll probably not last very long. And even if the whole society believes something such as Marxism and sticks to it and says, we believe in Marxism, no matter what will happen? Well, 70 years later, what do you know? The state collapses. So all of this encounters resistance of reality except the method of science, because you have to actually use these empirical methods, test it, and figure out whether or not your belief actually works. So note that this is overall, Peirce has this very logical, scientific approach, and basically just says that before we believe anything, we should ask ourselves two questions. How is it useful to us? Do we even need to worry about this belief? And in case of Descartes, he would say that belief is completely empty. But if it is not empty, how can we figure out whether it's true? We use the method of science. The fundamental hypothesis underlying this method is that there are real things whose characters are entirely independent of our opinion about them. Those realities affect our senses according to regular laws, and by taking advantage of the laws of perception, we can ascertain by reasoning how things really and truly are. By the way, he was a big fan of Kant, and he does kind of agree with Kant, at least in the sense of phenomenal world. Remember, Kant told us that the thing in itself we cannot know, but we can only know the phenomenal world. So essentially the only qualification he would give to that is to say, well, if we cannot know the thing in itself, let's just forget about it. It's one of those things which he would say empty doubt, empty notion. The thing in itself is nothing to us. It has no practical implication because we can never know it. You'd say, let's worry about the phenomenal world, which the science tells us about. He also worked on the theory of meaning. There's an important work he wrote, How to Make Our Ideas Clear, 1878. So according to Peirce, meaning is closely tied to our, again, interactions with the world. Practical effects that result from this interaction. If you want to know meaning of any word, you have to go through the practicality of it. Method of clarification. Consider what effects that might conceivably have practical bearing we conceive the object of our conception to have. Then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object. So, for example, let's say a meaning of the word chair. What does that entail? What is a chair? Exactly, something you should be able to sit on. And if you can't sit on that, then it's not a chair. And that's just the most important thing. Some of you guys took Philosophy 102 with me. We're talking about the definitions and how they are created. So this is the two ways we were talking about: the denotation and connotation. Denotation of a term, members of the class to which the term applies. So, for example, if you want to look at the word chair, right? The members of the class would be all the chairs in the world. Now, connotation of that term would be attributes something needs to have in order to be a chair. And we would say probably you should be able, it is something which of a particular shape and so on. But he adds this qualification here, and his qualification is very instrumental. He's saying what to expect is hypothesis containing the terms this should be if hypothesis containing the terms are true. What should we expect if something is a chair? What would be the consequence of that? And the consequence is we must be able to sit on it, right? If we can't sit on it, then it's not a chair. Even if it looks like a chair, even if it has all the attributes of the chair, it's just not a chair. So to him that is a most important essential characteristic. Now, from that point of view, again, if you look at the glass half empty, glass half full expression, he would say, well, there really is no difference, is there? Is there a difference between glass half empty, glass half full? Not if you want to drink. If you want to drink, all that matters is you have half a glass. Whether it's half empty or half full is irrelevant. And he also said, like I mentioned before, if you look at Berkeley's philosophy and say Hobbes' philosophy, that's the wrong one, Hobbes' philosophy, remember Hobbes was a materialist, right? And Berkeley was an idealist. But Peirce would say there's really no difference between them. There's no difference whatsoever. Why is there no difference? Because for practical purposes, Berkeley's philosophy will lead us to exactly the same conclusion as Hobbes. For practical purposes, even though Berkeley believes that the chair is the idea in God's head and God gives us this idea, we still kind of sit down on that chair when we are tired, don't we? Whether this chair is an idea in God's head in this sense is irrelevant to us. What's relevant is what we must be able to sit down on it if we are tired. So in truth and reality, he is saying we also want to know if our beliefs are true. So what does that mean for our belief to be true? How is it related to reality? Well, we can probably never get there, but the idea is this. Suppose we investigate scientifically everything around us forever and ever. So at some point, all the competent inquirers will reach one agreement about what reality is. And that would be the truth. We may never actually get there in practice, but in theory, suppose that all the scientists, all the thinkers were working for centuries and thousands of years, and eventually they must be able to reach this point. So this is what truth and reality really is. And the truth, he's saying, is their reality in that particular sense. Immediate object of thought is a true judgment in reality. So that is what the truth is. To think true conception of X and to think X is real is more or less the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. So if I say it is true that there is a bear in the forest, meaning a particular forest, that means there really is the bear in that forest. And again, reality in that sense and the truth in that sense is this final opinion. The community of inquirers will converge on if scientific method were applied for an indefinitely long period of time. Note that this is similar to Hegel. In Hegel, remember, whether we not will reach this point, we don't know. But nonetheless, this absolute idea, he's saying, is where we are kind of trying to get to as this absolute knowledge of reality, the true knowledge of reality. Another interesting concept he introduced, Fallibilism. What is Fallibilism? Fallibilism is just the position that any one of our beliefs may need to be revised in the future. So even though ideally, yes, there is that point when all these opinions converge, but we are obviously not there yet, right? We do have different opinions today. And for this reason, none of our opinions is infallible. In fact, he made this paradoxical claim that the only infallible statement is that all statements are fallible. In other words, the only thing we can be sure of is that we are not sure in anything. That actually is Socrates. We know one thing for sure is that we don't know anything. So anything you assert, even such things as the earth is round, that's not an infallible statement, because who knows what science can tell us in the future. Many things which we thought we know for sure turned out to be wrong. Again, science is the way to go, because that actually is the best method to eliminate doubt. But nonetheless, it cannot eliminate doubt completely, which is why even scientists sometimes are wrong. Okay. So the end, again, is not full-blown certainty. It's reassurance that any given time we can find provisional beliefs, and they're always provisional, that work in practice, joined with a method of proceeding on to better beliefs. This is what we kind of try to do, right? Define beliefs which work better for us. So what is the truth? It's a state of belief unassailable by doubt. And from that point of view, whether we will ever reach it, just like in Hegel, that can be left to questioning. Perhaps not. That brings us to William James, another figure who actually the book dedicates a lot more time to than Peirce. James was also a pragmatist. He actually popularized pragmatism. He was a lot more successful in it than Peirce because he had some very, very popular books he has written on the subject. He popularized pragmatism in 1898, famous lecture at the UC Berkeley, where he, lecture was called Pragmatism, where he talked about it to the audience. And like I said, unlike Peirce, who his entire life lived in quite a bit of obscurity, James was a lot more successful. Nonetheless, they had significant differences. In fact, Peirce was so upset about James's interpretation that he decided to change the name from pragmatism to pragmaticism. And he said, it's ugly enough, so I guess nobody will steal it from me anymore. And nobody will hijack it. So he considered James to be hijacking his idea. What's the differences? Well, for one thing, James was a lot more interested in morality and practical living. Peirce, more of a logician. To him, this is more of a logical question. James, a lot more of a humanist. To him, it's a practical question of, indeed, what does that mean? Like, in theory, you can agree with Peirce, but how should we live then? So he tried to work it out, and he also did a lot of work in psychology, so psychological approach. He was saying, well, for practical purposes, then you can say we should have a cash value of truth. If you have a belief, it should be valuable. It should give you something. So it's like the instrument. Anything you think is true, it's an instrument you're using in life. And whether it works or not determines whether it is indeed true. How can you handle reality thinking this is true? Again, going back to the bear in the forest. If you think it's true, but there are no bears in the forest, what happens? What's the cash value of this belief? If you never even go to the forest, it again doesn't matter. It's not practical. It doesn't matter. But if you ever do, that will become important. So true beliefs actually pay. They have this cash value. In other words, when it comes to it, you acting on that particular belief you have, and you get a payback. So, for example, if you have the belief that there is a bear in the forest, and you ever go to the forest, you will come prepared. You'll bring a rifle or something. You'll be ready. And then when the bear comes, you will kill the bear, and that will work out much better for you than if you have a wrong belief. Now, okay, but that kind of leads us to an interesting question on which they disagreed. So, can you have beliefs which work for you, but perhaps other people disagree? Perhaps they have not been properly tested by the scientific community. In other words, can you have a true belief which actually may not even be true, but it just works for you? Because James is saying the facts themselves are not true. They simply are. Truth is the function of beliefs that starts and terminates among them. And this is kind of leads us to this interesting question about why do people even disagree at all? right? If it was as simple as whether or not there is a bear, well, go to the forest and check, right? But there's questions where we disagree. What are the most fundamental questions we disagree about, like right now, for example, in this country? Can you think of anything? Well, do vaccines cause autism? It's more of a factual question because you can actually wait and see. Of course, we do disagree about it, but again, note that why do some people believe in vaccines and other people don't? Everybody claims facts on their side, and that always is easy to go by. Well, abortion is definitely one of these things, because can we really factually check that? Note that this is type of a value question, a value claim about whether or not it's a murder, whether or not it is something we should be doing. And it's not a kind of a factual question, because what are the facts there? There's certainly a fact that there is some sort of a fetus, and that fetus is aborted. But that is not what the question is about. The question is whether this fetus constitutes a baby and whether it's immoral to kill that baby. And that is not a question of fact. It's a question of value. And so on that question you can argue till you bleed, and you will never reach a conclusion. So essentially we do kind of have this kind of Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals, these two sides, right? It's a bit of a simplification, but nonetheless, they disagree on these fundamental questions, and these are not questions of fact, because you cannot simply prove something like this. And going back to vaccines again, note that most Republicans actually don't trust the vaccines. Why? Well, they come from the government. They don't trust the government. On the other hand, most Democrats actually trust the vaccines because they actually trust the government and they trust science a lot more. Most Republicans are religious, and obviously religion is not a very scientific approach, right? So this is where it kind of clashes. And I don't think the fact will ever prove that. Even though in terms of autism, yeah, sure, you can find out, but even in terms of things such as deaths, right? Well, there were, 3 people who died from Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It's a fact. Now, there's still a question there, though, how to interpret this fact. Some people are saying, look, people are dying. 3 people are dead. And 15 people have this thrombosis. Now, other people can say, but that's out of 8 million vaccinated people. If 8 million people get COVID, you will probably have about, 80,000 deaths. 80,000 is hell a lot more than 3. But what would be the answer from people who don't trust vaccines? They will say, well, 3 is still more than 0. I don't want to be dead, so I'm not going to do that. Whether or not I'll get COVID, that's up to God. But whether or not I'll get vaccine, that's up to me. I'm not getting the vaccine. So note that the fact is there. What matters is the interpretation. Well, yeah, there's also a matter when the fact can be wrong. But that's easier to check. You can check whether the fact is wrong. It's much harder with the interpretations, because there is no black and white about that one. Even if you agree that there are 3 people who died from the vaccine, and it is a fact, you can still have difference in opinion about whether that means you should get a vaccine or not. And for practical purposes, this is the only thing which matters, right? Isn't it the only thing which matters? Because that determines what will happen in the future with all of us. So if we all say, 3 deaths is way too much and we're not going to get any vaccine, and not only Johnson & Johnson, but the other ones too, because who knows, maybe nobody died yet, but it's only been 6 months, maybe we'll die in the future. So then you will not be getting a vaccine. So that will have implications. 5-10 years from now, there will be a result. On the other hand, suppose we go the other way and say, no, yeah, there are 3 people dead, but that's a lot less than dying from COVID. So then we all go and get a vaccine, and again, several years from now, there will be implications. Now, something tells me it it's probably not going to be like, oh my God, people started dying from the vaccine. That's highly unlikely, right? It's possible, but highly unlikely. What may happen? Well, maybe we'll discover that like 0.01% of people who got the vaccine do indeed have some sort of health consequences, maybe autism or whatever else, which is very unfortunate. But again, we can compare it to the effects of COVID and say, well, look, but here we have a lot more people who are not only dying, but also having those consequences, right? Because, there's long COVID, there's all sorts of health issues with people who had COVID. They can have damage to their heart, they can have damage to their brain, and so on. So that is actually proven fact. But these facts, to some people, don't matter because their beliefs lead them in another direction. Okay, so truth, according to James, is more or less equal to the word useful. He says, truth happens to any idea. It becomes true. It is made true by the events on the basis of whether or not it's useful. So if you have a belief which is useful, then it is true. And we can equally say, he says, it is useful because it is true, or we can say it is true because it is useful. And to James, that actually means the same thing. This is a big disagreement with Peirce. Peirce would not sign up to that. Many people have problem with that. They would say, no, wait a minute. Doesn't it kind of sound like anything you believe, again, could be true as long as it works for you? Well, James would say, no, not really. Because if it actually, let's say, fundamentally is on some level false, that will still lead to trouble. And so that will not be true, because it will not work for you. But in some areas, that opens up an important question. So what do you think about this statement? And the statement again is, it is useful because it is true, being absolutely equal to it is true because it is useful. Do you guys agree or disagree? Let's take another poll. Okay, again, 9 people answered. Anybody else wants to answer this question? Do you agree or disagree? I'm publishing the results. So 5 people agree, 4 people disagree. Again, it is quite an evenly mixed, right? Well, yes, but that is why it's not that simple. So James's response to these charges is this. He says, true ideas are those that can assimilate, validate, corroborate, and verify. So he is not committed to this kind of method of tenacity when you can just stick with something, believe it, end of story. False ideas, he's saying, will somehow still let themselves be known by the fact that you cannot fully assimilate them, validate them, or verify them. But he leaves a little bit of a door open there for subjective justification of a belief. Now, there is a possibility that you might accept something even if you are not completely sure about it. He's saying, of 2 competing views of the universe, which in all other respects are equal, but of which the first denies some vital human need, while the second satisfies it, the second will be favored by sane man for the simple reason that it makes the world seem more rational. And in his famous work, The Will to Believe, he actually kind of goes deeper into that, the argument that you can believe something if subjectively, for subjective reasons, that actually works for you. It makes your life better. Let's call it an option. You have an option to decide between 2 hypotheses, whatever they are. He's saying any option then could be either living or dead, forced or avoidable, momentous or trivial. So what does that mean? Well, some options are dead because they have no consequence for us. For example, whether Martians build the pyramids. It really does not affect our life either way, right? So he would say it's not a living option. It is dead option. Now, what would be the difference between forced option and avoidable? Well, sometimes you have questions which you have to answer. And sometimes we can say, yeah, like if you have a choice between these 3 doors, but you don't even need to go into any of these doors, it's avoidable. And finally, how important are the implications? Is it momentous? Does it have an important influence on your life? Or is it trivial? So maybe it's important, but it's not that much important. So you would like to know the correct answer there, but it's not like your whole life depends on it. So where does it all lead us? Well, he's saying genuine opinion, since philosophers continue to debate the existence of God, for example, that is clearly a life option, isn't it? It's not irrelevant. It is relevant. Now, is it forced? In other words, do we have to answer it? He's saying yes, because we live our life, right? So we have to make a choice here. We can either look at it from a religious perspective or not. We can either be an atheist or we can go to church. So there's no way to avoid that choice. If you don't go, let's say you are agnostic and you're saying, I don't know there's God or not, and I'm not committed either way, he's saying, well, you are making a choice that you are not going to church and you are not reading the Bible and you really not believing in God. That is a choice. So this choice is forced. Now, is it momentous? Do you think it's important? Yes, most people would say it's very important. I mean, it's not a trivial matter. So he's saying in cases like this, it's a genuine option. So we have to make a commitment either way. We can never discover it with scientific method. So we actually do have to decide. And so religious option, according to him, is genuine option. And whether or not, again, going from practical approach, whether or not we should believe on God or not, depends on does it work for us? Does it have some practical consequences? What would be the practical consequences for us if we believe on God compared to practical consequences if we don't? So that is the pragmatic approach to that question. Okay, so what's his answer there? Interestingly enough, he himself, despite arguing that point, never agreed to any specific religious view, because he did not think that kind of leads us to any specific religion. Because to be, for example, Christian rather than Muslim takes more than this kind of logic. So James himself did not think it gives us enough justification to be either one of them. Nonetheless, note that unlike Peirce, who approached it purely scientifically, and Peirce would say that's an empty question, because since we cannot know whether there is God or not, we cannot believe in something we don't know. James would answer this question with a lot of qualification. He would say some form of superhuman life with which we may, unknown to ourselves, be conscious possibly exists. And so you cannot dismiss it, and you do need to kind of answer this question to yourself. Okay, so this is all the time we have for pragmatism. Hopefully it helped you guys to understand it, and hopefully it helped you understand Kierkegaard a little bit better. So now on Wednesday we'll talk about Schopenhauer, which kind of goes back a little bit in time. But Schopenhauer is very interesting, very helpful to understand Nietzsche. Book talks about Schopenhauer very little. I will dedicate whole lecture to Schopenhauer. Many people say it's their favorite philosopher. He is kind of at the foundation of Kierkegaard too, even though not as directly as Nietzsche. Nietzsche is definitely responding to Schopenhauer, who he read when he was young. But Kierkegaard at one point mentions in his diary that he also read Schopenhauer's work and found it very close to his own ideas. However, there are differences. So next time we'll talk about Schopenhauer, but for now we are done. So I'll see you back on Wednesday. and hopefully you'll have great couple of days until then.